I'm Mark Dolan, good to see you. Now, I don't think anyone, perhaps even the man himself, has fully processed the scale, scope and vast implications of Donald Trump's landslide election victory. Winning by every conceivable metric, swing states, electoral college, popular vote and both houses, November the 5th, 2024 was a wholesale rejection of the status quo and a rejection of the leftist mission creep that is eroding the US and much of the free world. The change America is about to see will be cultural. Hated wokeism, including trans ideology and critical race theory, which works against Martin Luther King's dream of a colourblind society, will go into retreat. The change will be economic. Taxes and regulations will be curtailed and prosperity restored. And the change will be infrastructural. The rowing back on net zero and a push for not just energy independence, but energy dominance, with America once again exploiting its vast natural resources. There will be a complete overhaul of the electoral system so that it's fair, transparent and fit for purpose, including voter ID. All of this will restore ordinary Americans' faith in democracy. Trump doesn't have to destroy establishment media. They've done that for themselves with years and years of lying, as we saw during the campaign, with misinformation about abortion laws, the claim that Trump was going to end democracy, and that CBS 60 Minutes program, that interview with Kamala Harris, in which they edited in an answer on Israel from elsewhere in the interview. That was nothing less than propaganda and election interference. But mainstream media was toast long before this campaign, with the gaslighting of the American public, who could see as far back as 2020 that Joe Biden was in the full throes of senile dementia. But perhaps for many of us, notwithstanding Donald Trump's many faults and reservations that we may have about his character and approach, the most exciting prospect of the Donald's return to the White House will be the exposing of the COVID lies. Now, let me be clear that COVID was real, a potentially very nasty virus, crazily transmissible. It made too many of the people we know and love ill, and it took too many lives. But Trump's new administration will unearth the heady mix of incompetence, insanity and corruption that surrounded America's response to it, which will feed through into the response in the UK and across Europe. Now, whilst my sympathy goes out to anyone that was affected by this novel virus, let's be clear, the vast majority of the public faced a vanishing chance of being made seriously ill or dying from COVID-19. It was a predominantly mild seasonal respiratory virus with an average age of death of over 80, which is actually higher than life expectancy in most Western countries, including America. So technically, if you got COVID, you live longer. Now, I say that in jest, but that important statistic will surprise many who, to this day, were given the impression that this was the bubonic plague 2.0. The truth is that the bulk of those who tragically succumbed to this virus had serious comorbidities. But I hate to tell you, it was ever thus. If you're not a healthy person, if you have major health issues, very sadly, you are always at risk from any number of ailments, and you always will be. Them's the breaks. Obesity was another key metric in relation to risk profile from COVID-19, which is very sad, but what are you going to do? If you are overweight or obese, you also have a higher risk of heart disease, joint problems, kidney disease, depression, cancer, and in the longer term, dementia. For us to be surprised during COVID that anyone overweight was more vulnerable demonstrates that the virus was made to seem like we were all at risk. It wasn't true. We were not. But the truth is that we all paid the price, didn't we? We were all punished in the same way in what was, in my view, a vain and failed attempt to stop a respiratory virus, something that in history has never been achieved. Like I said at the time on my show on Talk Radio and latterly on GBNews, virus gonna virus. I got hell for saying it at the time, as well as hell for chopping up a face mask on the radio in a video that was seen 5 million times. And of course, anybody who spoke out was attacked and cancelled. Just like Twitter and other social media outlets were closing people's accounts for sharing the lab leak theory, which the head of the FBI, Christopher Wray, now thinks is the most likely explanation. I don't know why governments, aided and abetted by a complicit media profiting from state-sponsored scare ads, decided to create such hysteria around the virus. My best guess was their adherence to the scourge of health and safety culture, a perception among politicians in particular and the scientists advising them that whilst all evidence suggested this was a predominantly mild virus, they'd better exaggerate its threat in order to protect themselves from future criticism. If we drum up panic about this virus, they thought, and introduce draconian measures like lockdowns and masking, as well as those ridiculous arrows in supermarkets, then they can say, oh well, at least we did something. At least we took measures in the event of any future inquest or inquiry.
That guidance is backed up in law. It is not a request. It is a requirement in law, and people need to follow it.
So, for example, with regard to those masks, for which there was never any compelling data suggesting they would stop COVID, I think that the authorities simply covered our faces to cover their arses. It's my view that lockdowns were born out of panic. Fair enough, we're all human, and I do sympathise with any politician in the early stages of the pandemic sitting there in their office in the dead of night, imagining the worst case scenario. They didn't want to have blood on their hands. But ultimately, as with masking, given the lack of evidence that these damaging lockdowns would arrest the spread of the virus, you can only judge a decision to shut down the economy, to lock people in their homes, and to deprive children of a school education as having been largely performative. That's right, it's my view that the lockdowns were performative. It was part of COVID theatre and an approach of hashtag being seen to do something. What's most egregious about the COVID response from countries like the United States and the UK is the contrast with other locations, countries like Sweden, who did not lock down or enforced masking. They did no mask mandates, they didn't have lockdowns, they kept most schools and hospitality open, and they fared better than everyone else. Now, for those saying that Sweden is a different type of country, you can't compare the two. All right, why then did they even beat their Scandinavian neighbours? Shockingly, US and UK politicians and public health officials didn't learn any lessons as we went along. In fact, their actions became ever more illogical and pig ignorant. How countries like the US and the UK went into second and third lockdowns after data from no lockdown countries like Sweden showed a similar trajectory of the virus is anyone's guess. In the end, Sweden won the argument. Wait for this statistic, folks. They boast the lowest excess deaths in Europe from 2020 to 2022, with excess deaths being the most reliable and trustworthy metric. In fact, that remarkable trend on the part of Sweden carried on into 2023. The biggest problem with the pandemic response was that it didn't make sense, locking up healthy people and wrecking the economy for a virus for which a third of citizens would have no symptoms at all. That is official UK data, by the way. A third of people would be asymptomatic. In the UK, a COVID ad campaign said, act like you've got it. That's right. The main slogan of the ad campaign was, act like you've got it. So there you go. A pandemic so bad, you had to pretend to have the disease. In the novel 1984, George Orwell famously wrote, the party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. And during COVID, we were told not to believe our eyes and ears. None of it made sense. It didn't make sense that we were locked in our homes, but allowed to go to the supermarket for an hour a day with everyone else. It didn't make sense that you could sit on an airplane or in a restaurant in a mask, but could remove the mask when it was time for dinner. Who knew that COVID was so repelled by the sight of someone swallowing their food? It didn't make sense that states like Florida and Texas, with full sports stadia and people conducting largely normal lives, existed alongside states like New York and California, whose residents existed under totalitarian COVID rule. Same country, different pandemic, apparently. And it didn't make sense that early in the pandemic, top medics like Anthony Fauci in the US and Jenny Harries in the UK advised against wearing masks.
People should not be walking around with masks.
Which Harries in particular said could be counterproductive. But above and beyond that, it didn't make sense that the masks, the holes in which are 500 to 1,000 times larger than the virus, were somehow, miraculously, I don't know how, maybe osmosis or something, going to stop COVID. The masks, of course, were not a public health policy. It was propaganda to remind you that we were in a pandemic, and was the brainchild not of medics, but of behavioural scientists. Those blue surgical masks, which now pollute oceans and are festering in landfill, can at best stop a surgeon dribbling saliva onto your internal organs when he or she performs open heart surgery. The Germans mandated higher, superior quality masks, but the virus trajectory remained the same as other countries. A mask was never going to stop a tiny virus, and it never will. Donald Trump's administration will expose all of that with the help of RFK Jr., who exposed America's chief scientific advisor in the book The Real Anthony Fauci. Fauci has not sued for a syllable written in that rather damning book. Can't imagine why. So why does all of this matter? Why can't we just move on? All of this is in the past. Why does the truth need to come out? Well, because of the needless damage done to people after this, in my view, failed experiment. And because we've got to make sure it never happens again. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, one of the world's leading medics at Stanford Medical School, called lockdowns the biggest public health mistake in history. He and his colleagues, who signed the Great Barrington Declaration, which argued for focused protection of the vulnerable, were attacked, vilified and censored. But of course, looking back on it, they were right. After all, look at the lonely pensioners who died alone during the pandemic, socially distanced from their loved ones. Children whose life chances and mental health have been eviscerated as a result of lost school hours and contact with their friends and teachers. Worth noting the physical and psychological damage to children of being forced to wear those wretched, filthy masks in the classroom all day long, without even a shred of evidence that suggested that would stop COVID. That was cruelty. That was child abuse. The economic damage that we've seen as a result of lockdowns has threatened stability across the world in terms of the economy, as countries printed empty billions, leading to eye-watering levels of debt to be paid for by future generations, and the crippling inflation which has hurt the poorest most. The once viable small to medium-sized businesses that went to the wall, whilst corporate giants like Pfizer, Amazon and Google enjoyed the greatest gold rush in history. Now, I was broadcasting throughout the pandemic, and I called out the insanity of almost all of these measures. So how would I have done things differently? Well, I would have done Sweden times 100. I would have informed people about the risk of the virus, and I would have written a blank check to place a ring of steel around the vulnerable, and I would have let everybody else get on with their lives. Show me one country in the world that had little to no measures, and show me a disproportionately higher death toll from COVID. No such country exists. Going back to Sweden, you would expect there, wouldn't you? You would expect there to be more dead Swedish people. Well, the same goes for Florida, which should have seen more deaths given their light touch throughout the pandemic. Well, you would expect a disproportionately high death toll. Again, it cannot be found. In fact, a study published in the revered medical journal The Lancet suggested that when adjusted for age and levels of public health, Florida actually fared better than Stalinist lockdown-loving California. But here's the best bit, folks. Because whilst the new Trump administration will expose the folly of lockdowns and masking and social distancing, the 6-meter rule, all that nonsense, all measures, by the way, inspired by the Chinese Communist Party, it's the vaccine rollout which may be the greatest travesty of all. The key selling point of the vaccine was that if you took it, you protected others. The greatest lie at the heart of this public health fiasco. Now, the vaccine may have protected those vulnerable to the virus who faced hospitalization or death, and for that we can be delighted it was invented and indeed that people got it. But in the 3 years since the release of the first jabs, no medic has successfully explained to me why healthy people needed to be pressurized into taking this vaccine when they faced no mortal risk from COVID. But it was a jab which came with potential negative side effects. Let me tell you a tragic story, and it's Lisa Shaw, a BBC radio producer in her 40s, a slim, healthy, fit mother of one, and a much-loved wife to her husband Gareth, who I've been in touch with. Now, Lisa was not someone who was in an at-risk category. The bottom line is that you don't need to be the professor of medicine at Harvard to know that Lisa Shaw did not technically need to be vaccinated based upon her health profile. She could have got COVID. She would have got COVID. She might not have had symptoms. She could have been one of the third of people who had no symptoms at all. Act like you've got it. Or she might have spent a day or two in bed with flu-like symptoms. Statistically, COVID would not have killed her. But the vaccine did. It is the cause of death on her death certificate. And now Gareth is widowed and their little boy orphaned. Now, was the jab rollout motivated by profit on the part of the pharmaceutical companies rather than public health? Well, this new administration will find the answer. But it's odd that, for example, the UK government's own vaccine agency, the JCVI, advised against jabbing children, but pressed on with the rollout anyway. Make it make sense. The UK government, on the advice of its chief scientific officer, ignored this ruling from the JCVI and jabbed kids. The mortal threat from COVID to children was statistically almost non-existent. Broadly speaking, COVID didn't kill kids. The flu, in fact, is worse for kids in terms of mortality. And yet, with concerns around blood clotting and myocarditis, particularly around young men and boys, that's a serious condition, by the way, involving inflammation of the heart, then we risked the lives and the health of the most precious and vulnerable group in our society, children. We dragged them out of school, impacted their life prospects, made them miserable as they couldn't see their friends or jump on the swings in the park or play ball, and we injected them with a medication any doctor that wasn't in the grip of this insane mass psychosis would consider needless. The medical mantra, first do no harm, was discarded during the pandemic, as we also harmed the economy, as we harmed free speech and free scientific debate, as we harmed the elderly, as we harmed the environment. Those filthy masks that aren't recyclable have now entered fish and therefore ultimately the human food chain, as well as those mountains of plastic from the testing kits. A virus, by the way, so bad you had to test yourself for it every day. Make it make sense. We harmed the economy, we harmed mental health, we harmed and ruined people's lives. First do no harm became first do so much harm. And under Donald Trump, those responsible will be exposed and held to account. We weren't victims of COVID. We were victims of the response to it. And it's time now for those responsible to be held to account. Some of them should be locked down in jail.